Afternoon, everyone. Mr. McKeever here, and I am here to talk to you about the birth of the modern world, and particularly in this case, the European Union. This is our last lesson in this video little series that we have done, so hopefully you can, take a moment and revel in that motion at the end of this period. All right, so let's talk about this. What we have here is the modern world, and one of the most indicative aspects of that is the birth of the internet. Now, this is going to be a key driving factor in everything that's taking place as part of this whole modern world, and it, originates in the 1980s and doesn't really become truly popularized until the middle of the 1990s, but it's going to be a driving factor in some of the stuff that we talk about throughout the course of this lesson. But that being said, we're really going to focus on all the different aspects of the 1990s, and in particular, this case, the birth of the European Union, because these are the key things that have taken place in the last 25 to 30 years of European history. So, dot-com boom, it's great. All of this internet stuff is awesome. Now, interestingly enough, the original dot-com boom was a bunch of sites that you guys probably don't even recognize today. Yahoo, eBay, maybe you guys buy a thing on there every now and then. None of you guys have seen MySpace before. AOL doesn't even exist. But, Google actually rules the world, so, that makes sense. But what we see is that the internet has a huge lasting impact, not just in the ability to get information or buy stuff online and all of that stuff, but that it really starts creating a global community. And as we see in the 1980s and 90s, there is a definite shift towards that global community mentality throughout the world. And this is kind of our segue into what's going to happen with the European Union. This whole global community really began a long time before, as there were steps prior to the creation of the European Union that led us down this path. But today we still very much see this global community mentality. There is not just the European Union in the world. There's also an African Union. There's also agreements with Asian countries, pan-trans-Pacific partnerships between Asian countries and even South American trading companies. All of this stuff is out there as the world are getting much closer together thanks to things like the internet facilitating that. But we are going to begin with the European Union where it really starts. And that goes all the way back into the 1950s. After World War II, there's a definite effort by European countries to not just work together militarily in the NATO alliance that has already existed, but also economically. And we see the creation of the European Economic Community. Originally, it only started out with a few nations like France, Luxembourg, Belgium, West Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. But that is going to continue to grow, encompassing more and more and more Western European nations. And eventually, it becomes alive. Mwah. Yay, Frankenstein clip. But I'm going to skip that video that explains the birth of the European Union. Feel free to watch that in your own leisure. But what we see is eventually this all starts to lead us towards the European Union in the 1990s. In 1993, we see the original membership there of Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, Netherlands, UK, Ireland, Denmark, Germany, United Germany now, Italy, and Greece. And then as the 90s into the 2000s moved on, more and more nations joined it. A new influx came in 1995 with the Scandinavian nations and Austria. Then we saw many of the former Warsaw Pact nations in Eastern Europe join in 2004, a few more of them in 2007. In 2013, we finally see Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia join. Now, there are still some nations that are working towards that as well now, too. Turkey is a big candidate nation for the European Union, but has faced a lot of opposition towards it due to the humanitarian issues with the populations there and the government under the current leader, Erdogan, who, is not exactly viewed very favorably around a lot of the world. But the European Union is still a very strong political and economic organization today. What its goal is intended to be is a group of European countries that participates in a world economy with one economic unit, the euro, and with the goal of creating a barrier-free trade zone to enhance economic wealth through more efficiency within its marketplace. So, what does that mean? Well, it means a variety of different things. One, there's one currency amongst all member nations of the European Union, and that is the euro. You could have a euro in Spain, you could go to England, it's the exact same bill or coin to be used there. There's no exchange rates, anything like that. That's to make actual economics and transactions easier. Another aspect about it is for the movement of people within those populations. If you are in France and you wanted to travel to the Netherlands for the weekend, you could quite literally just drive there. There is not customs that you would have to go through that would inhibit your ability to move from one European nation within the Union to another, as well as providing more economic clout around the world. The European Union, when it's working together, is one of the largest economic bodies in the world. This is why this is really important today. Individually, European nations, while significant in the global economics of things, are, at best a fraction of the size of the U.S. economy. The largest European economy at this time is Germany, and Germany's economy is less than a quarter of the size of the U.S. economy at its best time. But when they work together, and now these numbers are a little bit dated because it was hard to find a chart within the last few years, they have one of the most competitive economies in the world. The European Union, in its full power, is an incredible economic bloc for them to work with. It makes it just as important economically as China or the United States. Now, the question is whether or not the European Union itself is sustainable. If you've been paying attention to the news over the course of the last few years, you know that there's a lot of challenges right that. There is not a lot of economic growth in Europe right now. Part of that has to do with the fact that there is some significant inequality between the different countries. There are some countries that have a much more growing post-industrialized economy, like in Germany, and other countries, such as in Italy, that have gone through incredible economic challenges. So there's frustration amongst the various different member nations. Why are people in Germany paying for the economic struggles of what's happening in Italy? And at the same time, people in the rest of Europe are like, why do places like France and Germany seem to have a lot more say in what's going on in the European Union than other countries do? So this has become a pretty huge challenge for the European Union in the last few years. Not to mention the fact that there are countries trying to actively leave it. We have now seen the removal of Britain from the European Union. Those deals are actually still being figured out right now. This was something that was originally decided years ago, and they still haven't figured out how to make it a smooth transition out. But there's also a movement within France to potentially leave as well, too, and that would be a huge economic blow to the European Union, as France is, I believe, the second largest economy within Europe right now, after the departure of England. There are some desires for less regulation, that countries could be able to make their own decisions on certain issues, particularly immigration. There is also a significant fear of migrant people moving from the Middle East. This is something that began with an event that was taking place in North Africa called the Arab Spring, where a bunch of people decided, because of the governments that were in many of these nations that were very oppressive, like in Libya and in Egypt, large populations of people were escaping as refugees into Europe. And for many European countries, they were scared as to how to deal with this. It was a huge influx of population at the time. And this is still a struggle today. There are still countries today that either have no infrastructure in place to deal with these large populations of refugees coming from the Middle East and North Africa, or there are people who just actively don't want people from North Africa or the Middle East coming to their countries. So there's backlash in the European Union itself as to whether or not immigration should be something that the European Union has a say over. So all of this is playing a part into what the situation is in the European Union today. You can watch that as well too as you see fit. So what does this mean in the future? Well, we may see in the next decade or so France leaving the European Union. We don't know. The situation with France seems to have cooled down a bit in the last few years. There was definitely a lot more fervor towards the French leaving before we saw the calamity that was Brexit and the British leaving. I do think that, this is not something that's gone entirely, but we may see some growing sentiment at some point in time within France for that to take place. I don't know. What we do see, though, is that economics are shifting around the world. As we look forward to the next few years, you can start to see that a lot of these different countries that had been economic powerhouses for the last 100, 200, 300 years are actually becoming kind of outclassed by other nations in the world. Right now, as of 2013, the United States had the largest economy in the world by a substantial margin, but some expectations have that by, just 6, 7, 8 years from now, China will overtake the US due to the rate of their economic growth because they're just a much larger population of people. We also see that when we look at these projections in 2028, of the top 10 economies in the world, there aren't a lot of European options left. Maybe Britain and Germany hold on. But when you look at that in comparison to before, where half the list was a European nation, we can see that Europe's economic power is waning a little bit. We also know that there's a large environmental movement that takes place in Europe today. Environmentalism is one of the strongest political movements within the entire continent. And it's something that has continued to grow over the course of the last decade, as we see particularly now the northern European nations of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, really pioneer this real important emphasis on protecting the environment, as they are much more susceptible immediately to the effects of potentially any climate change that takes place. Because we see it. Global temperatures are rising, and they're continuing to rise as well, too. So this is a motivating factor in Europe, and we're going to skip the video that goes along with that. But at the end of the day, Europe is evolving. The countries themselves, while they don't have the same economic, importance that maybe they once did in comparison to the global capacity of the world, are still incredibly important political drivers of action, as well as, some of the most modern post-industrial economies in the world. So with that, we wrap up all of our video lessons for the years. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. Have a great day.